Now, on the point about Cuba, the USS Nimitz entering Caribbean waters near Cuba today. This after the former president of Cuba, Raul Castro, was indicted yesterday on those murder charges connected to shooting down a jet all the way back in 1996. The maneuvering by the United States has a lot of people wondering now what is going to happen. Is the president, for example, running the Maduro playbook now in Cuba? Staff Judge Advocate for Marine Forces Cyberspace Command, Chris Burnett, is our guest to talk about all this. Good to have you, Chris. Is it like a Maduro Venezuela 2.0 that might happen in Cuba?
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for having me this afternoon. I was the Staff Judge Advocate at MARFOR Cyber. I've now retired from the Marine Corps, and I'm running for Congress in Maryland's 6th Congressional District. But to answer your question, I think what the president has done is prudent military planning. And that is, you want to have the ability to escalate any military operations. You never want to find yourself in a position reacting to the enemy or undersourced. And I think what you have here, now that you have an indictment and you have a basis for an extraction, is you want to have overwhelming military force in the region to provide for any possible contingency. And oftentimes, just the mere presence of a U.S. military force is enough to bring about the changes that we're expecting. And that could be that he is turned over, or that this happens peaceably, and that the U.S. military personnel in the region are only there as a possible contingency of escalation, but more than likely for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief.
What if it didn't work that way and more was deemed to be necessary? I've heard some analysis the last couple of days and having conversations about this, that it might be more challenging, or, obviously Venezuela was one day and Maduro's was brought here to New York. Is it the same, or do you see different challenges if it tried to repeat that in Castro's case?
I think militarily this might actually be simpler. You're talking about a much smaller force. Now, we have complications given that we have U.S. personnel stationed on Cuba, in Guantanamo Bay. So that creates a vulnerability that didn't necessarily exist in Venezuela. But in terms of air defense and in terms of forces available in Cuba, it's a fraction of what we saw in Venezuela. I think there's a more complicated political and diplomatic scenario that could follow, given Cuba's status in the region. So my hope is that this either can resolve itself without military intervention, or if there is military intervention, that it will be very similar to what you saw in Venezuela. And that was U.S. military in support of a law enforcement function, and that function being they were effectuating an indictment. They extracted somebody and they returned him to where he was indicted in New York. Here, that would just be into Florida.
No, I get that. And then the other thing I think that is important here is that it's not all happening in isolation. I mean, we have the war with Iran. Venezuela's already happened. And when you ask people, and you would be cognizant of this running for Congress, do they support this? Do they want more foreign military intervention, or whatever phrase you want to use to describe these operations? They're not very popular. Even Cuba, ahead of it, people say, I don't know. I'm tired of this, to paraphrase the polls. What do you say to people who say this is just too much right now, too much going on outside our soil?
As someone who spent a considerable amount of time in the Middle East, 5 separate deployments, 4 on the ground in Iraq and 1 aboard a Marine Expeditionary Unit, I'm not excited about a lot of this military adventurism. But I will say this. It was unacceptable to have a threat in our own hemisphere. And what I mean by that was Russian and Chinese interests, military equipment and military personnel would often stop in Cuba or in Venezuela, or had dual-use facilities across the southern hemisphere. So really what we're doing right now is we're cleaning up a mess that has been in the making for decades. I spent several years at U.S. Southern Command as the international and operational law advisor to the combatant commander. And I can tell you that we were oftentimes undersourced in terms of equipment and personnel. And we had to watch these external influences hold our region at risk. So I'm not excited about this, and certainly in Congress, I would want to look very closely at the cost of these things, both in terms of the human cost to our forces, but also the budgetary implications. But ultimately, these are problems that we needed to resolve, and if we can resolve them quickly and we can resolve them decisively, My hope is this will improve our national security posture.
So that's what, real quick on Iran that we're covering this hour in the current Congress, this war powers vote. How do you see that? How would you assess that if you had to?
I would want to take a very close look at it, but I am not in favor of limiting Article 2, Section 2 power of the president. There is a strong argument that the War Powers Resolution of 1973 in and of itself is unconstitutional. This attempt to further politicize national security and foreign policy only weakens our position. I understand congressional oversight, and I understand the role of Congress when it comes to deploying forces, maintaining a military, and then approving long-term commitments. But when you have ongoing national security threats, there's a reason why Article 2, Section 2 authority rests with the commander-in-chief, and that is the president. Any attempt to politicize it, unfortunately, you're only weakening our position and you're putting U.S. forces at risk.
Right. Well, that's the idea. The president has been arguing that, and others presidents have, by the way, that it's unconstitutional. We'll cover that with Iran War Powers vote this hour. Thank you, sir. We appreciate it. That's Chris Burnett.